stuns everyone. 11:47 p.m. The executive floor of Whitaker Industries sits under emergency lights, long trembling bars of pale neon crawling across marble and glass. On the cold hallway tile, a man in a wrinkled yellow maintenance uniform sits cross-legged, lips moving over numbers only he can see. A battered economics textbook, spine mummified in electrical tape, rests in his hands. Margin notes crowd every page like small rebellions. "Compound interest," he whispers, tracing formulas with a calloused finger. "The eighth wonder of the world." The mahogany door at the end of the corridor swings open hard enough to rattle the glass. "What am I looking at?" Richard Whitaker III, platinum watch, tailored midnight suit, a face trained never to apologize, fills the doorway, silhouette cut from money and certainty. "My janitor studying on the executive floor?" His voice is soft, which makes it worse. "Tell me, does that book know how to mop?" Daniel Washington lifts his eyes. He doesn't scramble. He doesn't beg. He places an index card inside the textbook to save his place. Whitaker steps closer, plucks the book from Daniel's hands, and holds it up like contraband. A few loose pages drift down, pale as fallen leaves. "Studying in the dark," he says, almost amused. "Some people are born to clean. Some are born to lead." The hallway hums. The light flickers. The distance between a mop bucket and a board seat feels like a continent. Daniel stands, not taller, just steadier. "Mr. Whitaker," he says, voice even, "before you decide what I'm born to do, what's your plan for the yuan devaluation hitting your Singapore exposure next quarter?" Silence. Then the smallest crack appears in a very expensive mask. Because tonight isn't about a janitor in the dark. It's about what happens when the man no one sees starts seeing everything, and says it out loud. If you believe nobody should be mocked for wanting to learn, hit that like button and subscribe. What Daniel reveals next will shake this building from the lobby to the boardroom. Daniel rose slowly to his feet, brushing dust from his knees. When he looked up, his eyes held a quiet intensity that made Whitaker unconsciously take a step back. "Mr. Whitaker," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest, "do you know the difference between fixed and variable costs in your quarterly projections?" Whitaker blinked, caught off guard. "What did you just—" "Fixed costs remain constant regardless of production volume," Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength. "Rent, insurance, executive salaries, variable costs fluctuate with output, raw materials, labor, utilities. But here's what your board doesn't understand." Daniel's weathered finger traced invisible calculations in the air. "You're treating your R&D as a variable cost when it should be fixed. That's why your innovation pipeline dried up 3 quarters ago. Your competitors—" Daniel paused, watching Whitaker's face pale. "Increased fixed R&D spending by 47% while you cut yours by 32%. The textbook slipped from Whitaker's fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud. "Where—" Whitaker's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Where the hell did you learn that?" Daniel bent down and carefully gathered the scattered pages, his movements deliberate and patient. When he stood, he clutched the reassembled book like a shield. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you, sir." Whitaker's mind raced. Those weren't memorized phrases. This man understood market dynamics that his own executives struggled with. The janitor's analysis of Samsung's strategy was more accurate than last week's board presentation. "Try me," Whitaker whispered, his arrogance cracking like ice over deep water. Daniel's eyes held secrets that seemed to stretch back decades. But before he could answer, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. 28 years earlier. 8-year-old Daniel pressed his face against the rain-streaked window of the city bus, watching the glittering downtown towers grow smaller behind them. His mother, Sarah, sat beside him in her cleaning lady uniform, counting crumpled bills from her purse. "Mama, why can't I go to the fancy school with the white kids?" young Daniel had asked. Sarah's calloused hand touched his cheek. "Baby, school buildings don't make smart children. Books do. Hearts do. You remember that?" That night, in their cramped apartment above the laundromat, Daniel found his mother on her knees, scrubbing floors she'd already cleaned twice. Textbooks, discarded ones she'd rescued from dumpsters behind the private school, lay open around her like scattered treasures. "Mama, what are you doing?" "Learning," she whispered, not looking up. "So I can teach you what they won't." Back in the present. Daniel's voice broke slightly as he spoke to Whitaker. "My mother cleaned offices just like this one for 30 years. Every night she'd bring home the newspapers and magazines your executives threw away. Wall Street journals, Forbes, Harvard Business Reviews." He held up the battered textbook. "This belonged to your predecessor's son. Found it in a dumpster outside his dorm. Mama always said, 'One person's trash.'" Whitaker found himself finishing the sentence, remembering his own grandmother's words. "Is another person's treasure?" Daniel nodded. "I've been reading your company's financial reports for 15 years, sir. Every quarterly statement, every SEC filing. I know your debt-to-equity ratio better than you do." Whitaker's legs felt weak. He sank into his leather executive chair, staring at this man who cleaned his toilets by day and consumed financial knowledge by night. 15 years. Whitaker's voice was barely audible. "Since my mother died," Daniel confirmed. "Cancer. No insurance. Medical bills took everything but—" He smiled sadly. "She left me her real inheritance. The hunger to know more." The office door creaked open, and Marcus Patterson, Whitaker's senior vice president, peered inside. His perfectly groomed eyebrows shot up when he saw the janitor standing beside his boss's desk. "Richard? Everything all right in—" Marcus stopped mid-sentence, his gaze falling on the textbook in Daniel's hands. "What exactly is happening here? Comment below if you've ever been underestimated because of how you look. What happens next will show you how far prejudice run deep." Marcus stepped fully into the room, his $5,000 suit a stark contrast to Daniel's stained work clothes. His nose wrinkled slightly, as if he detected an unpleasant odor. "Sir, I hate to interrupt whatever charity case this is," Marcus said, shooting Daniel a dismissive look. "But we have the Singapore merger call in 20 minutes and—" "Marcus," Whitaker interrupted, his voice strange and distant. "What's our current position on the yuan devaluation?" "Well, obviously we're hedged through the Swiss accounts, and our exposure is minimal because of the—" "Wrong." The word came from Daniel, quiet but firm. Marcus spun around, his face flushing red. "Excuse me?" "You're thinking about the old yuan hedging strategy," Daniel continued, meeting Marcus's glare without flinching. "But China shifted monetary policy 6 weeks ago. Your Swiss hedges are now working against you. Every day you hold that position, you're losing approximately $2.3 million. The color drained from Marcus's face. "That's... How could you possibly—" "Because unlike you," Daniel said quietly, "I read more than just the executive summaries." Whitaker leaned forward in his chair, fascination replacing his earlier mockery. "Daniel, what would you do?" "Reallocate through Singapore commodities," Daniel replied without hesitation. "Specifically rare earth minerals. China's about to announce restrictions next quarter. I saw the preliminary reports in the Financial Times last Tuesday. Page 6, bottom right column." Marcus stuttered. "But sir, surely you're not going to take financial advice from a—" "From a what, Marcus?" Whitaker's voice carried a dangerous edge. The silence stretched taut between them. Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, while Daniel stood perfectly still, dignity wrapped around him like armor. Set up a meeting, Whitaker said finally. Tomorrow morning, full board. Marcus looked like he'd been slapped. Sir? He joins us, Whitaker continued, nodding toward Daniel. I want to hear what else he has to say. Daniel's textbook trembled in his hands. In 15 years of cleaning these offices, he'd never imagined sitting at the mahogany conference table where decisions worth billions were made. But as Marcus's face twisted with barely contained rage, Daniel realized his biggest challenge wouldn't be proving his intelligence. The 42nd floor conference room hummed with tension at 9 a.m. sharp. 12 of the city's most powerful executives sat around a table that cost more than most people's homes, their conversations dying as the door opened. Daniel walked in wearing his yellow janitor's uniform, the only professional clothes he owned. His mop bucket sat by the door like a monument to his past, while his future hung in the balance of the next 60 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, Whitaker announced, I'd like you to meet our newest consultant. Victoria Chen, the chief financial officer, adjusted her glasses and frowned. Richard, is this some kind of diversity initiative? Because if you're trying to... Is this a joke? Marcus Patterson's voice cut through the room like a blade. He leaned back in his chair, smirking. Bring in a janitor to discuss the Singapore merger? What's next? Asking the security guard to restructure our debt. Several executives chuckled. Daniel felt the familiar burn of humiliation in his chest, but when he looked at Whitaker, something unexpected passed between them. A silent challenge. The Singapore deal, Whitaker said quietly, is worth $2.8 billion. Daniel, the floor is yours. Daniel's hands shook as he approached the massive display screen. Every eye in the room was on him, some curious, others openly hostile. He picked up the digital stylus and began drawing diagrams that most of them had only seen in graduate-level textbooks. The proposed merger structure assumes Singapore's financial services sector will remain stable, Daniel began, his voice growing stronger with each word. But that assumption ignores three critical factors. He drew interconnected circles on the screen, showing relationships between markets, currencies, and geopolitical tensions. First, Malaysia's new trade agreements will redirect 40% of regional shipping through Kuala Lumpur within 18 months. Second, the Federal Reserve's interest rate projections don't account for India's emerging cryptocurrency regulations. Third, Daniel turned to face the room. China's Belt and Road Initiative is about to shift $500 billion in infrastructure investment away from Singapore. The room fell silent. Victoria Chen leaned forward, her skepticism melting into interest. How could you possibly know about classified Fed projections? She asked. They're not classified if you know where to look, Daniel replied. Cross-reference the Jackson Hole Symposium transcripts with the Basel III implementation timeline. The patterns are clear if you... This is insane! Marcus slammed his hand on the table, making coffee cups jump. We're taking financial advice from a man who mops floors. This is fraud. A staged performance. He stood up, pointing an accusing finger at Daniel. Who's feeding him this information? Which competitor paid you to sabotage our deal? Every head turned toward Whitaker, waiting for his response. The billionaire sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. But in the silence, something extraordinary happened. Whitaker rose slowly from his chair, the weight of realization heavy in his voice. Marcus, sit down. But sir, this is clearly... I said sit. Down. The command carried absolute authority. Marcus dropped into his chair like a stone, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Whitaker walked to the window overlooking the city, his hands clasped behind his back. Daniel, tell them about your education. Self-taught. 22 years of night study. MIT OpenCourseWare, Stanford's online programs, Khan Academy. Daniel's voice grew stronger. Every economic theory, every financial model, every case study your business schools teach. I've studied them all. Victoria Chen's calculator was already out. If his projections about the Singapore shipping redirections are accurate, we'd lose $340 million in the first year alone. They are accurate, Whitaker said quietly. I've been checking his analysis all night. Every number, every projection, every geopolitical assessment. He turned back to the room. He's right about everything. Marcus's mouth fell open. Several other executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Daniel stepped forward, his dignity intact despite the uniform he wore. I never wanted to prove anyone wrong. His voice cracked slightly. I just wanted a chance to rise without being judged by the color of my skin or the tools in my hands. The conference room fell into profound silence. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled below them. Millions of people struggling to rise above their circumstances, just like Daniel. There's something else, Whitaker said, his voice heavy with shame. Something I haven't told you all. He walked to his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. 3 months ago, I hired a private investigator to look into our security. I thought someone was accessing our files after hours. Whitaker's hands trembled as he opened the folder. What I found instead? The folder contained security camera footage, timestamps, computer access logs, and photocopied pages covered in Daniel's handwriting, complex financial analyses that predicted every major decision the board had made in the past quarter. Daniel has been quietly solving problems we didn't even know we had, Whitaker continued. His recommendations, if we'd followed them, would have saved us $180 million this year. Marcus looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. But he's just a what? Daniel asked, his voice calm but powerful. A janitor? A black man? Someone who doesn't belong in your world? He walked to his mop bucket and lifted it, setting it on the mahogany table. This bucket has been in more boardrooms than most executives. It's heard merger discussions worth billions, witnessed handshake deals that shaped markets, absorbed the secrets spilled in wastebaskets and forgotten on whiteboards. Daniel's eyes swept the room. The question isn't whether I belong here. The question is whether you're brave enough to judge intelligence by its merit instead of its packaging. The tension in the room was suffocating. But then, something no one expected happened. Subscribe if you believe hidden genius deserves recognition. The next moment will restore your faith in humanity. Victoria Chen stood up first. I motion to accept Daniel's recommendations on the Singapore restructure, she said, her voice clear and decisive. His analysis is the most comprehensive I've seen in 20 years. Seconded, came a voice from the other end of the table. Then another. Seconded. Marcus looked around the room in disbelief as hands rose one by one. You can't be serious. This man pushes a mop. And you push papers, snapped Victoria. At least his work shows results. Whitaker walked over to Daniel, his earlier arrogance completely gone. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Daniel, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you justice. He turned to face the board. I'm offering Daniel a full scholarship to complete his MBA at Wharton, company-sponsored. Additionally, he'll join our executive team as senior strategic analyst, effective immediately. The room erupted. Some executives applauded, others sat in stunned silence. Marcus jumped to his feet, his face purple with rage. This is insanity! You're going to trust a janitor with billion-dollar decisions? What about credentials? What about results? Daniel interrupted quietly. What about 15 years of perfect predictions? What about solutions that could have saved your shareholders hundreds of millions? He walked to the whiteboard and began writing a series of numbers. Marcus, your hedge fund recommendation from last quarter? It lost $23 million. My alternative strategy, The one I wrote in my notes and threw in the trash would have gained 67 million. The room fell silent as Daniel continued writing. Victoria's cryptocurrency position? Down 15 million. My suggestion would have been up 34 million. Tom's real estate portfolio? Down 8 million. Mine would have been up 22 million. Each number was a dagger through the heart of their assumptions about intelligence, education, and worth. But here's what matters most, Daniel said, turning back to face them. None of this was about proving you wrong. It was about proving that brilliance doesn't have a uniform, and wisdom doesn't have a color. Marcus stormed toward the door, but Whitaker's voice stopped him cold. Marcus, where do you think you're going? I refuse to work under these circumstances, Marcus spat. A janitor giving me orders? I have standards. Yes, Whitaker replied quietly. You do. Unfortunately, they're the wrong ones. As Marcus slammed the door behind him, the remaining executives looked at Daniel with new eyes, seeing not a custodian, but a colleague who had earned his place through merit alone. But the biggest transformation was yet to come. Marcus's shoes struck the marble like gunshots as he stormed down the corridor, humiliation boiling into something darker. To a man like him, being exposed by a janitor wasn't just an insult, it was an unforgivable crime. That night, a black sedan crawled behind Daniel as he walked home from his shift. He didn't notice at first. His mind was still racing with disbelief over what had just happened, his textbook tucked tightly under his arm like a lifeline. Half a block from the subway entrance, two men stepped out. Suits, polished shoes, but the wrong kind of polished, the kind that meant muscle for hire. Mr. Washington, one said flatly. You're coming with us. Before Daniel could answer, they shoved him against the wall, rifling through his satchel. Loose index cards fluttered into the gutter, scribbled formulas, graphs, notes that had taken him years to piece together. Boss says you've been poking your nose where it doesn't belong, the taller man muttered. Hand over everything you've written, and maybe you walk away. Daniel's jaw tightened. His entire life's work, 15 years of study, every late night spent hunched over borrowed books, was about to be stolen. But survival wasn't about fists. It was about clarity. With steady voice, he said, You don't even know what you're holding. Those numbers, they're predictions, ones your boss is too stupid to understand. If you burn them, fine. But remember this. The markets don't listen to Marcus Patterson. They listen to math, and math doesn't lie. For a split second, the men hesitated. Their orders were simple. Intimidate, confiscate. But Daniel's calm unnerved them more than fear ever could. Headlights swept across the street. A patrol car rounded the corner. Startled, the men bolted into the sedan and screeched away, leaving papers scattered in the gutter. Daniel gathered them up with shaking hands, his heart hammering. A police officer approached, eyeing the bruises on his arm. You all right, sir? Daniel nodded, clutching the textbook to his chest. I've survived worse. Next morning, when news of the attempted assault hit Whitaker's desk, complete with a license plate that traced back to Marcus's personal security detail, the boardroom was stunned into silence. It was no longer about a janitor's hidden brilliance. It was about a corrupt executive so desperate to protect his pride that he'd turned criminal. Whitaker stood slowly, voice heavy with authority. Gentlemen, the man Marcus tried to silence is the same man who's been solving problems under our noses for years. Today he takes Marcus's seat. 1 year later, the emergency light still flickered in the executive hallway, but everything else had changed. Daniel Washington now walked in a tailored charcoal suit, his nameplate reading, Senior Vice President of Strategic Innovation. That night he returned to the same spot where Whitaker once found him. Sitting cross-legged with a new textbook in hand, he smiled when Whitaker appeared. Still studying in the dark? Whitaker asked. Old habits, Daniel said. On the wall hung a bronze plaque. Knowledge belongs to everyone. Never underestimate a dreamer. Daniel Washington. Beneath it, Whitaker told him the board had approved the Sarah Washington Memorial Fund, scholarships for dreamers like Daniel's mother once envisioned. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. The door opened again. 8-year-old Kenya Williams, the first scholarship recipient, peeked in shyly. "Mr. Daniel, Mama says you're going to help me go to the smart school?" "That's right," Daniel said gently. He showed her his textbook. "School buildings don't make smart children. Books do. Hearts do. And dreams." He looked up at the flickering light. Dreams are the brightest light of all. 5 years later. The Sarah Washington Foundation had changed countless lives. Daniel stood before the United Nations no longer a janitor, but a voice for the voiceless. "Dignity has no uniform," he said. "Brilliance has no color. And genius can be found anywhere, if we're brave enough to see it." In the front row sat Kenya, now 13, and accepted into MIT, clutching the battered economics textbook Daniel once carried. Around the world, other dreamers studied in the dark, knowing their moment would come. Because Daniel Washington proved that the light had always been there. He simply taught the world to see it. If Daniel's journey lit a spark in you, share this story with someone who needs to be seen. And don't forget to subscribe, because every week